good evening, and welcome to Sleepy Time History. Today, we will take a look at one of the most crucial moments of World War II. If you enjoy these narrations, please consider liking and subscribing for more content. If there is a historical event you'd wish to hear next, please consider leaving a comment. And now, to the story. D-Day, the turning point of World War II. June 6th, 1944. It began in the darkness, long before dawn broke over the coast of northern France. The world held its breath as thousands of ships crossed the choppy waters of the English Channel, carrying the hopes of a world at war. This day, now known simply as D-Day, would mark the largest amphibious invasion in human history. It was the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. But victory was far from certain. What unfolded was an operation defined by courage, chaos, sacrifice, and a determination to reclaim a free Europe. This is the story of the Normandy landings. World War II had already raged for nearly 5 years. Hitler's Germany controlled most of mainland Europe. France had fallen in 1940. The Soviet Union had suffered horrific losses on the Eastern Front. But by 1944, the tide was turning. The Allies, led by Britain, the United States, and Canada, had long planned an invasion to liberate Western Europe. The operation would be called Operation Overlord, and its opening move, the landing on the beaches of Normandy. Planning began over a year in advance. The Allies faced enormous logistical challenges. They needed to move hundreds of thousands of troops, vehicles, supplies, and weapons across the Channel. They had to land them safely on enemy-occupied beaches, under fire, and then keep them supplied in the days to follow. The target, a 50-mile stretch of the Normandy coast, divided into 5 landing zones. From west to east, they were codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The defenders, hardened German troops, deeply entrenched behind a network of bunkers, artillery positions, and machine gun nests. Hitler's Atlantic Wall was designed to repel any such invasion. The Allies knew this would not be easy. Phase 1. The first hours of D-Day. Before the sun rose over the coast of Normandy on June 6, 1944, before the first boat touched the shore, before the beach assaults even began, the invasion of Europe had already started. This was Phase 1 of D-Day, a massive, complex series of airborne landings and deception operations launched under the cover of night. It was a gamble, bold, dangerous, and unlike anything seen before in modern warfare. It began just after midnight. Across southern England, the skies filled with the roar of engines. Over 1,200 aircraft took off, carrying nearly 24,000 paratroopers from the United States, Britain, and Canada. Their destination, the dark countryside of Normandy. Their mission, to land behind enemy lines and create chaos before the beach landings at dawn. Let's start with the Americans. 2 elite divisions, the 82nd and the 101st Airborne, had been training for months. These weren't ordinary infantry. They were specially trained to jump from C-47 transport planes into hostile territory. Loaded with rifles, ammunition, and gear, each paratrooper carried up to 100 pounds on his back. Their drop zones were just inland from Utah Beach, on the western edge of the invasion area. The 101st Airborne, known as the Screaming Eagles, had been tasked with seizing key causeways and road junctions. These routes were critical. They were the only way the troops landing on Utah Beach could push inland. Meanwhile, the 82nd Airborne, nicknamed the All-American Division, was assigned to capture and hold the town of Sainte-Mère-Église, one of the first towns in France to be liberated on D-Day. They would also secure key bridges over the Murderette River to prevent German reinforcements from counterattacking. But almost nothing went to plan. Thick clouds, poor visibility, German anti-aircraft fire, and navigational errors scattered the American drops across miles of French countryside. Many paratroopers were dropped far from their intended zones. Some were separated from their units. Others were dropped right into German positions or flooded fields that had been deliberately inundated by the Germans to slow any invasion. Many drowned under the weight of their gear. Others were shot before they hit the ground. One of the first American casualties of D-Day was a paratrooper who landed in Sainte-Mère-Église, right in the middle of a German-occupied town. He was shot as he hung from a tree, tangled in his parachute lines. Despite the chaos, the American airborne troops adapted quickly. Groups of soldiers, sometimes just a handful, linked up in the dark, using passwords and cricket clickers to identify friend from foe. They began conducting hit-and-run attacks on German patrols, blowing up bridges and seizing crossroads. They fought hedgerow by hedgerow, using intuition and grit. It was not the coordinated assault commanders had hoped for, but their presence behind enemy lines sowed confusion. German commanders weren't sure how large the force was, or where the main assault would come. Further east, British and Canadian airborne troops were executing their own daring missions. Shortly after midnight, gliders landed silently near the Orne River and Caen Canal, east of the landing beaches. These gliders carried troops from the British 6th Airborne Division. Their objective? To capture key bridges, especially Pegasus Bridge, and hold them against German counterattacks. The operation was one of the most daring of the night. Gliders touched down just yards from the bridge under cover of darkness. The British troops stormed across and secured it within minutes. This lightning-fast assault prevented German tanks from reinforcing the beaches once the main invasion began. Nearby, other units of the 6th Airborne blew up bridges to the east, preventing German reinforcements from reaching the front lines. They also attacked the Merville Battery, a heavily fortified German gun position that threatened Sword Beach. Despite heavy losses and scattered landings, they succeeded in neutralizing the battery before dawn. All throughout the night, the Normandy countryside erupted into chaos. German defenders were stunned. There was no radio confirmation, no clear pattern to the attacks. Units were reporting paratroopers in every direction. Some German commanders believed the main invasion had already begun. Others hesitated, unsure if the landings were real or a diversion. And then there was Operation Titanic. As part of the deception strategy, the Allies dropped hundreds of dummy paratroopers, lifelike mannequins, across other parts of France. Explosives inside the dummies mimicked gunfire. Radios broadcast fake messages. This phantom army drew German forces away from the real drop zones, creating even more confusion. But none of this would have worked without one key component: Operation Fortitude. This was the grand deception campaign designed to convince the Germans that the real invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. Fake armies were created in England, complete with inflatable tanks, wooden aircraft, and dummy radio traffic. German intelligence had been fed false information for months. They believed General Patton, whom Hitler feared, was leading a force across from Calais. The ruse worked. Even as paratroopers landed in Normandy and ships began crossing the Channel, German High Command refused to believe Normandy was the main target. Hitler held back vital panzer divisions, convinced the real invasion was still to come. And so, in the early hours of June 6, 1944, the Allied airdrops not only disrupted German positions, they delayed their response, fractured their defenses, and sowed just enough confusion to give the coming beach landings a fighting chance. While the airborne operations raged inland, the Channel was filling with ships. By 3 a.m., the invasion fleet was in motion. It was the largest naval armada the world had ever seen. Over 5,000 ships and landing craft, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transports, and tank carriers. Minesweepers cleared paths through the water. Hundreds of smaller vessels ferried troops across the 100-mile stretch from England to Normandy. The scale of it was staggering. Naval officers, engineers, and sailors had rehearsed for months. The logistics of moving this many men, supplies, and equipment in a single night had never been attempted before. By 5 a.m., the coast of Normandy came into view. Naval guns began bombarding German positions on the beaches. Shells screamed overhead, pounding bunkers and gun nests. The sea shook with the force of the barrage, but many of the fortifications, especially at Omaha Beach, survived the bombardment. On the ships, the soldiers waited in silence. Many were seasick from the rough crossing. Some wrote final letters home. Others prayed, holding their rifles close, knowing full well what awaited them on the sand. As dawn approached, the landing craft began lowering into the waves. Infantry loaded in, engines fired, the ramps went up, and the first waves began the long, slow crawl toward shore. But for the paratroopers already on the ground, the beach landings were their lifeline. They had done their part. Now they had to hold until the rest of the army arrived. By the time the first landing craft touched down, the airborne troops had already been fighting for nearly 6 hours. Scattered, exhausted, and low on supplies, they had slowed the German response, seized vital ground, and shaped the battlefield. They were the tip of the spear. Their sacrifices in the early hours of D-Day made the landings possible. Without them, the beaches could have been slaughterhouses. Without them, the Germans could have overwhelmed the landing zones before they were even secure. And without them, the dream of liberating France might have died before it even began. This was the first phase of D-Day, a night of courage in the dark, a test of will, skill, and determination, a mission full of risk and uncertainty, carried out by ordinary men asked to do extraordinary things. And as the sun finally rose on the morning of June 6, 1944, the second phase was just beginning. The beach landings were about to begin. Phase 2. Utah and Omaha Beach landings. As the first light broke over the coast of Normandy, June 6, 1944, the second phase of the D-Day invasion began. The sea, grey and restless, stretched to the horizon, filled with the silhouettes of Allied ships and landing craft. Above them, the sky buzzed with aircraft, and on the beaches ahead, dug into concrete bunkers and firing positions, the German defenders waited. The assault began at the far western flank of the invasion, Utah Beach. Utah was the westernmost of the 5 designated landing beaches. The American 4th Infantry Division was assigned to land there, supported by units from the 82nd and 101st Airborne, who had already parachuted inland hours earlier. The beach itself was relatively narrow, flanked by flooded fields and swampy terrain. German defenses included machine gun nests, artillery positions, barbed wire, and anti-tank obstacles. But it was not the strongest sector of the Atlantic Wall, and a stroke of luck would work in the Americans' favor. As the landing craft approached, strong currents pushed the first wave of U.S. troops nearly 2,000 yards south of their original landing point. In many operations, this kind of error would be catastrophic, but at Utah, it was the opposite. The mislanding brought the troops to a section of beach that was less fortified, lightly defended compared to their planned landing zone. General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the son of former President Theodore Roosevelt, was among the first to land. Despite arthritis and a heart condition, he had insisted on leading his men ashore. When he realized they were off course, he reportedly said, "We'll start the war from right here." And they did. Roosevelt's calm under fire, combined with the relatively weak German response, allowed the Americans to move off the beach quickly. Engineers cleared obstacles, infantry pushed inland, paratroopers, already operating behind enemy lines, helped guide the landing forces toward key causeways and exits off the beach. By mid-morning, the Americans had secured a strong foothold at Utah. Casualties were light, fewer than 200 men killed, wounded, or missing, an almost unbelievable outcome for an invasion of this scale. But just a few miles to the east, a very different battle was unfolding. Omaha Beach. The name would become etched into history. Omaha was assigned to elements of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions, supported by Army Rangers. Their objective was simple in theory: land, advance inland, and link up with airborne forces. But Omaha was a nightmare waiting to happen. The geography itself was unforgiving. A narrow beach with soft sand and shingle sloped up to bluffs that rose 100 feet above sea level. German troops had used this high ground to build a killing zone, interlocking fields of fire, machine gun nests, anti-tank guns, mortars, and artillery zeroed in on every possible landing point. To make matters worse, the pre-invasion bombing and naval shelling had largely missed their targets. Many German defenses remained intact. As the first wave of landing craft approached at 6:30 a.m., chaos erupted. Machine guns opened up immediately, ripping through the surf. Mortar rounds exploded in the shallows. Barbed wire and wooden stakes blocked the beach. Anti-tank traps, nicknamed hedgehogs, littered the shoreline. The tide was rising fast, pinning the troops between the water and the gunfire. For the men in the first wave, it was slaughter. Entire units were wiped out before they could fire a shot. Landing craft were destroyed by mines or direct hits. Some soldiers drowned under the weight of their gear. Others made it ashore, only to be mowed down within seconds. There was little coordination. Radios were waterlogged. Commanders killed. Engineers trying to clear obstacles were gunned down in the open. At one point, some officers considered abandoning Omaha altogether, but the soldiers on the ground refused to quit. Small groups began to inch their way forward. Using craters for cover, crawling through sand and blood, they pressed toward the base of the bluffs. Rangers scaled the cliffs with ropes under fire. Engineers blew gaps in the wire. Infantrymen fought their way up ravines, using grenades, bayonets, and raw courage. One group, pinned down for hours near a wrecked landing craft, finally broke through a weak point in the German line. That opening widened, slowly, painfully. By noon, the Americans had taken parts of the bluff. German positions were being flanked. Still, the beach was a scene of horror. Burning vehicles, bodies in the surf, wounded men calling for help, the air thick with smoke and sand. Despite the chaos, more waves of troops kept landing. Tanks, those that made it to shore, joined the fight. Naval destroyers moved dangerously close to the beach, firing directly into German bunkers at point-blank range. Their support proved crucial, and the tide began to turn. By mid-afternoon, American forces had seized key high ground overlooking the beach. The surviving German defenders began to withdraw. The beachhead was secure, but the cost had been staggering. At Omaha, over 2,000 American soldiers were killed or wounded in a single morning. The exact number may never be known. The fighting was that intense, the conditions that brutal. Omaha had nearly failed, but it didn't, because of the courage and perseverance of ordinary soldiers in impossible circumstances. Together, Utah and Omaha illustrated the extremes of D-Day. At Utah, a missed landing and weaker opposition allowed for rapid success. At Omaha, everything went wrong. And yet, through sheer grit and determination, the beach was taken. By nightfall on June 6th, both beaches were firmly in Allied hands. American forces began pushing inland, linking up with paratroopers and seizing key towns and roads. The cost had been high, but the objective had been achieved. They had landed. The Atlantic Wall had been broken, and Hitler's fortress Europe now had a breach. For the men who survived Omaha, the memory never faded. Many spoke little of what they saw. Others carried the scars, physical and emotional, for the rest of their lives. They had walked through fire and refused to fall. Today, the sands of Omaha Beach are calm. Tourists walk where soldiers once bled. Crosses mark the resting places of those who never made it home. And yet, the memory endures, because what happened there was more than a military operation. It was a testament to the power of human will, the unshakable resolve of free people standing against tyranny. Utah and Omaha were just 2 of 5 landing zones that morning. But on those beaches, in those crucial hours, the fate of the free world hung in the balance. And because they held, because they fought and advanced, the road to victory remained open. The day America stormed the gates of occupied Europe and did not retreat. Sword, Juno, and gold. Britain and Canada's fight on D-Day. While American forces fought to gain ground on Utah and Omaha beaches, a massive assault was unfolding farther to the east. On the morning of June 6, 1944, British and Canadian troops launched their own attack on the beaches of Normandy, storming three key sectors: Gold, Juno, and Sword. Together, they formed the eastern half of the D-Day landings. Their objective: to seize vital towns and roads, secure the left flank of the invasion, and link up with airborne forces who had landed during the night. These beaches were defended by elements of the German 716th Infantry Division, supported by coastal artillery, minefields, and reinforced concrete bunkers. Though not as heavily fortified as Omaha, these defenses were still formidable, and the fighting that unfolded was fierce, personal, and costly. Let's start with the westernmost of the three: Gold Beach. Gold Beach. Gold was assigned to British forces from the 50th Northumbrian Infantry Division, supported by Royal Navy warships, engineers, and specialized tanks known as funnies, modified vehicles designed to deal with beach obstacles, clear mines, or carry portable bridges. The assault began just after 7:25 a.m., following a naval bombardment that targeted German strongpoints along the coast. But high winds and a rising tide made landings difficult. Some tanks and landing craft were delayed. Others were lost in the surf. As British infantry moved ashore, they faced machine gun fire, mortar shells, and mines. At La Hamel and La Rivière, German bunkers poured fire onto the beach. Engineers worked under fire to clear obstacles and open paths for vehicles. Flamethrowers and demolition teams took out pillboxes at close range. But British momentum built quickly. By midday, the 50th Division had pushed through German defenses and begun to move inland. They captured the town of Arromanches, a key site where a mulberry harbor, a portable artificial port, would soon be constructed to supply the Allied invasion. The British advance at Gold was one of the most successful of the day. They moved 6 miles inland by nightfall, linking up with Canadian forces to their east and beginning the push toward the town of Bayeux, Juno Beach. To the east of Gold, Juno Beach was assigned to Canadian forces, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, supported by the Royal Canadian Navy and Air Force. The Canadians faced some of the strongest resistance of any beach, on par with the horrors of Omaha. Rough seas delayed their landing, forcing the first wave to arrive late and at high tide. This reduced the amount of exposed beach, but compressed the landing zone into a tight kill zone. As landing craft approached the beach near the towns of Courseulles-sur-Mer, Bernières, and Saint-Aubin, they were met with intense fire. German machine guns and anti-tank guns opened up from reinforced bunkers. The Canadians lost nearly 50% of their first wave within minutes, but they did not stop. Engineers, under fire, cleared lanes through minefields and barbed wire. Infantry fought house to house through seaside towns. At Bernières-sur-Mer, a single platoon of the Queen's Own Rifles cleared an entire German block with grenades and bayonets. By early afternoon, they had pushed off the beach. Canadian armor, delayed in the early hours, finally arrived to support the infantry. Together, they began the advance inland, fighting through hedgerows, fortified farmhouses, and German strongpoints. One of the primary objectives was to link up with the British at Sword Beach and advance toward Caen, a major city and road hub. But German counterattacks and stiff resistance prevented a full link-up on D-Day itself. Still, the Canadian achievement at Juno was extraordinary. By nightfall, they had advanced farther inland than any other Allied unit on D-Day, up to 10 miles in some sectors. But it had come at a heavy price. Over 1,000 casualties, including more than 340 killed. Juno had been a blood-soaked success. Sword Beach. Finally, at the far eastern edge of the landing zones was Sword Beach. Sword was assigned to the British 3rd Infantry Division, supported by Royal Marine Commandos and a brigade of French Free Forces. Their mission? Land near the town of Ouistreham, secure the road to Caen, and link up with British airborne forces holding bridges to the east. The landing began at 7:25 a.m., following a heavy bombardment. As the British came ashore, they encountered stiff resistance, especially near strongpoints at Lyon-sur-Mer and Hermanville. But here, Allied planning and coordination made a decisive difference. The use of specialized tanks, including flame-throwing Churchill crocodiles and mine-clearing flails, helped break German defenses. Infantry moved quickly, clearing German bunkers and moving through seaside resorts turned into fortresses. By late morning, most of the beach was under British control. Further inland, commandos of Lord Lovat's 1st Special Service Brigade marched from the beach to relieve the British 6th Airborne Division, which had captured the Pegasus Bridge in a daring night assault. In one of the most famous moments of D-Day, Lord Lovat arrived at the bridge accompanied by Bill Millen, a piper who played his bagpipes as bullets whizzed by, an act of defiance and symbolism that echoed through history. Despite these gains, the British advance toward Caen, their key objective, was halted by a fierce counterattack. In the afternoon, elements of the 21st Panzer Division, one of the only German armored units close enough to respond on D-Day, launched a limited assault between Sword and Juno. British anti-tank guns and air support stopped them short of the beaches, but it was a warning. The fight for Normandy was only beginning. The eastern flank holds. By the end of June 6th, the British and Canadian landings had achieved their main objectives. The beaches were secure. Thousands of troops and tons of equipment were ashore. Key towns and strongpoints had been taken. And most importantly, the Allies had not been thrown back into the sea. But they had not captured Caen, a major strategic goal. It would take 6 weeks of brutal urban fighting before the city finally fell. Still, the significance of their success cannot be overstated. The eastern flank of the Allied invasion had held firm. The Germans had failed to break the line, and from Sword, Juno, and Gold, the Allies would begin their push through the hedgerows of Normandy, toward Paris, and eventually toward Berlin. For the British and Canadian soldiers who fought there, D-Day was not just a battle. It was a moment of national identity. For Canada, It was the largest military operation the country had ever undertaken, a defining chapter in its history. For Britain, it was the beginning of redemption after 4 years of German occupation of France. By nightfall, nearly 160,000 Allied troops had landed in Normandy. They held fragile beachheads, but the fight was far from over. The Germans counterattacked. Hedgerows, narrow lanes, and fortified towns turned Normandy into a nightmare battlefield in the weeks that followed. But the landings had succeeded. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. Hitler's forces were now fighting a war on 2 fronts, east and west. In the days that followed, Allied forces poured into Normandy. More than 2 million troops would eventually cross the Channel. The breakout from the beachhead in late July opened the path to Paris. By August, the French capital was liberated, and within a year, the war in Europe was over. The German defenses, the Atlantic Wall, and the failure to stop D-Day. To understand how the Allies succeeded on D-Day, we also have to ask a different question. Why did the Germans fail to stop them? After all, the Nazis had years to prepare for an invasion. Hitler knew an Allied assault would come eventually, and by 1944, they had turned the coastline of Western Europe into a fortress, or so they believed. They called it the Atlantic Wall. Stretching from the northern tip of Norway all the way to the French-Spanish border, the Atlantic Wall was meant to be an impenetrable line of defense. It included thousands of bunkers, pillboxes, gun emplacements, tank traps, minefields, and beach obstacles. But the truth is, the wall was not as strong or as well organized as it seemed. Let's start with the concept. After the fall of France in 1940, Hitler feared a cross-channel invasion, but for several years it didn't come. Instead, the Allies focused on North Africa, then Italy. By the time the Atlantic Wall became a serious priority, it was already 1943, and the war was turning against Germany. Hitler ordered Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, to take command of Army Group B and oversee the defense of northern France. Rommel had seen firsthand what Allied air power and mobility could do. He understood that if the Allies landed successfully, Germany might not have the strength to push them back. So he believed the invasion had to be stopped on the beaches. Rommel's strategy was simple: choke the landings before they could gain a foothold. He knew once the Allies were ashore in large numbers, with armor and artillery, they would be almost impossible to dislodge. To do that, he focused on reinforcing the beach defenses. He ordered the construction of millions of beach obstacles, wooden stakes, metal hedgehogs, Belgian gates, and mines designed to destroy landing craft and slow vehicles. He flooded low-lying fields inland to trap paratroopers. He added anti-glider poles, nicknamed Rommel's asparagus, to prevent airborne landings. He laid over 6 million landmines across the region. Concrete bunkers were built into hillsides and cliffs, housing artillery and machine guns with interlocking fields of fire. Mortars and flak cannons were positioned to hit both air and ground targets. Observation posts and radar stations kept watch on the channel. But despite these preparations, the defenses had serious flaws. First, and most importantly, the wall was incomplete. By June 1944, much of the Atlantic Wall was still under construction. Many bunkers were unfinished. Reinforcements were uneven. In some sectors, like Omaha Beach, defenses were dense and deadly. In others, like Utah Beach, the defenses were far weaker. Secondly, resources were stretched thin. The German war machine was overextended. Supplies, concrete, steel, and manpower were all limited. Rommel was forced to rely on thousands of conscripted laborers, many of them prisoners or forced workers from occupied countries. The quality of construction varied widely. Many units were undertrained or made up of older reservists and so-called Ost battalions, Eastern Europeans forced into German service. Third, the German High Command was divided. Rommel and his superior, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, disagreed on how best to respond to an invasion. Rommel insisted on concentrating defenses near the coast to defeat the Allies the moment they landed. Rundstedt believed in holding the panzer divisions farther inland, ready to counterattack once the main landing point was clear. But Hitler, obsessed with central control, refused to settle the argument. He kept the key armored divisions under his personal authority. When the invasion came, no one had the power to move the panzers quickly. By the time they were released, it was already too late. The final, and perhaps most critical failure, was one of intelligence. The Germans did not expect the landings at Normandy. Thanks to the Allies' brilliant deception campaign, Operation Fortitude, German High Command was convinced that the real invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point between England and France. Fake radio traffic, dummy tanks, and even a decoy army under General Patton reinforced the illusion. Even as Allied paratroopers landed in Normandy, even as the beaches were being stormed, Hitler and his generals believed it might be a diversion. And so, when the call came in the early hours of June 6th, many German units were caught unprepared. Some commanders waited for confirmation before acting. Others assumed it was a small raid. The armored divisions, held in reserve, were not released until the afternoon. Key officers, including Rommel himself, were away from the front. Rommel had returned to Germany for his wife's birthday and was on the road when the invasion began. All of these failures compounded. The Atlantic Wall could not hold without fast reinforcements, and the reinforcements never arrived in time. By the time the German response took shape, the Allies had already landed over 150,000 troops, with tanks, artillery, and air support in place. The chance to throw them back into the sea, Rommel's worst fear, was gone. And with that, the myth of the Atlantic Wall collapsed. It had looked powerful on a map. It had sounded fearsome in propaganda. But in practice, it was no match for Allied planning, coordination, and overwhelming force. Rommel would later say, "The first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive. The fate of Germany depends on the outcome. For the Allies, as well as Germany, it will be the longest day." He was right, and for Germany, it was the beginning of the end. The failure of the German defenses on D-Day was not just about concrete and cannons. It was a failure of planning, of leadership, of communication. It was the result of a regime that demanded obedience over initiative, loyalty over logic. The Atlantic Wall was supposed to stop the Allies cold. Instead, it became their first foothold in the liberation of Europe. The cost of D-Day was immense. Over 4,000 Allied troops were killed on June 6th alone. Thousands more were wounded or missing. The beaches of Normandy became hallowed ground, soaked in sacrifice. Today, cemeteries overlook those same shores, rows of white crosses and stars of David, stretching to the horizon. Each one marks a life given for freedom. The success of D-Day was not guaranteed. It was not the result of luck alone. It came from planning, bravery, innovation, and the sheer determination of thousands of men who stormed those beaches and skies, knowing many would never return. They were soldiers, sailors, paratroopers, engineers, medics, brothers, sons, and fathers. They changed the course of history. Their legacy lives on. D-Day was more than just a military victory. It was a statement to the world that tyranny would not stand, that freedom was worth fighting for, and that unity among nations could overcome even the darkest forces. 80 years later, we remember them. We honor their sacrifice, and we tell their story, not as just history, but as a lesson in courage, in sacrifice, and in what it means to fight for something greater than ourselves. June 6th, 1944. D-Day, the day the tide turned.